Bienvenue tous. Welcome to Reporters here on France 24. I'm Mark Owen. 100 years ago, the Russian Revolution changed the world. Lenin and his comrades forced into being a new ideology, communism. But in 2017, the Kremlin seems to be doing its best to sweep this landmark anniversary under the carpet. There's been much to lament during the Soviet period, much bloodshed and oppression to be ashamed of. But there have been achievements that rightly should be praised. Our reporters Senya Bolshakova, Veronica Dorman and Gilles Terrier have travelled to 3 major Russian cities to speak to people whose lives have been shaped by the revolutionary past. Has the remembrance of that period been altered by the retelling?
In January 1917, mass demonstrations and general strikes burst onto the streets of Petrograd. By the following month, the bloody unrest had intensified. Mutinous soldiers and workers came together as the first Soviets. In March, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and by October, the Bolsheviks had control of the Russian capital. 1917 is the year Russia was, quite simply, transformed.
Революция, дикость,
Exode.
трагедия для всей страны.
A century has passed since Russia's revolution, and while the Soviet Union may no longer exist, the legacy of 1917 is omnipresent. The landscape is scattered with imposing reminders, and vast commemorative statues adorn the streets.
My dear friends, this year is not a simple one for us. It's the centenary of the Great Russian Revolution, the reason our country is known throughout the world. We honor the memory of the man who was able to see it through, the man who made sure not only that we would live with hope, but with the certainty that our bright future will come. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin.
Lenin's body remains on display for all to see in central Moscow. Some would prefer him buried, but the government is keen not to antagonize communists, who remain a powerful political force in Russia. For them, Lenin's body serves as a repository for national memory.
I'm Inessa Armand. I'm a writer and a documentary maker. I'm the great niece of Inessa Armand.
Moscow's Red Square isn't only home to Lenin's mausoleum. Lining the walls to the Kremlin is something of a revolutionary necropolis, the final resting place of scores of Bolshevik heroes.
Inessa was one of the first Bolshevik women to be buried with honours here in the Red Square. Back then, they decided to bury the most important party figures here. And later they decided to extend the honour to eminent scientists, too. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin is buried here. It's a huge honour for their families. It's the Red Square, after all, the heart of Russia.
With the memory of her great aunt looming large, Renee and her family were brought up venerating the communist ideology that underpinned the October Revolution.
Inessa had a lot of experience as a Bolshevik and as a covert operator. She was imprisoned twice. She was ordered into exile because she was found distributing propaganda among factory workers. I've read accounts of simple workers who said that they were extremely impressed by this woman, who wore a hat and who came to see you to explain the principles of Marxism in a way that was really accessible.
Born into a wealthy bourgeois family, Inessa was mother to 5 children. But she gave it all up for Lenin. She translated his writings and was sent on often dangerous missions. The pair exchanged thousands of letters, correspondence that reveals the intensity and, according to some, the intimacy of their relationship.
Пошли сплетни вот эти.
There were rumours about the nature of their relationship, but those closest to the Bolshevik leader, like Zinoviev, always denied it. Of course, the love of her life should have been Lenin, a man dedicated in body and soul to the revolution, like she was. But there's a very famous letter from Inessa to Lenin with a line in it that reads, "It's here that we left each other." And I think that actually there was a moment where they had to decide whether to make something of it or to cut it off, to go forward or to stop. And Lenin decided that they couldn't succumb to adultery.
Что, конечно, они не могут пойти на адюльтер.
Товарищи красноармейцы, капиталисты Англии, Америки, Франции ведут войну против России. Они помогают деньгами и военными припасами русским помещикам, которые ведут против советской власти войска из Сибири, Дона, Северного Кавказа, желая восстановить власть царя, власть помещиков, власть капиталистов.
"100 years later, and this church is holding a mass for the White Army officers killed during the civil war that followed the revolution.
This war between the Reds and the Whites, it was like a knife in the heart of our people. We pray that the souls of those fighters rest in peace, those men who took part in those military campaigns.
My name is George Sorgan. I'm from a family that was part of the mass White Army immigration. My family fled to France, and that's where I was born, in 1963. Bless me, Father.
Are you Russian or French?
I'm from France, but I've been living in Russia for 12 years. There are lots of people with similar stories here today. My wife's grandfather was an officer in the White Movement. As for me, well, one of my great-grandfathers was the governor of the Tula region. The other was the mayor of Moscow before the revolution.
I hope that your land, everything that is yours, is returned to you.
Father, that's not so important. The most important thing is that God has returned to Russia. The bishop in charge of this monastery made this tower available so that we could open an exhibition in memory of the many White Army-affiliated Russians who fled Russia via Sevastopol in 1921. 120 boats left. That's 150,000 people who abandoned the shores of Sevastopol. And that's the story that's being told here.
In total, 2.5 million people left Russia in the tumultuous years that followed 1917. The Whites, made up of everyone from religious leaders and intellectuals to aristocrats and generals, were singled out as the enemy of the Red Revolution.
Thousands of people were uprooted from the country they loved. They had their traditions, their values, their religion, and there was the Russian soil. Those people were just uprooted, plain and simple. They all hoped they one day return, but in the end, no one did.
Only when the USSR fell could the grandchildren of those who fled travel to Russia to engage firsthand with their heritage. Georges chose to move to Russia permanently.
Мы простимся на мосту, ночь никто нас не встретит, мы простимся на мосту.
Georges was named after his grandfather. An officer in the Imperial Army, he was arrested by the Bolshevik secret police. He was sentenced to 10 years in the Solovki prison camp, the Soviets' first gulag. He was shot dead there in 1929. 2 years later, Georges' grandmother left the USSR for France.
This is my grandmother's passport, Alexandrine Osorgin, born Galitsyn. You can see her here in a photo with my aunt Marina and my father Michel. This is the passport they used to get out of the Soviet Union in 1931. My grandmother did something amazing. She left with very little in the ways of possessions. But she did bring all the letters her husband had sent to her from prison. And we still have them all. They're really astounding.
The letters contain details of life inside the camp and declarations of love for the children he'd never see grow up. Those, along with the file on his grandfather released by the FSB archives, helped Georges piece together a missing chapter in his family history. So at what point, in what context, did you learn about 1917?
To be honest, it was taboo. We never discussed it, not even amongst ourselves. In fact, we had a history book that stopped right before the revolution. Our great-grandparents, our grandparents too, I think they lived through something so enormous, so difficult, and they wanted to protect us from that. They went through what can only be described as a trauma.
Ils ont souhaité nous protéger en fait de ça, de ce traumatisme. C'est un traumatisme qu'ils ont subi.
Moscow has never officially asked forgiveness from the descendants of the whites forced into exile or from the victims of Soviet repression themselves. And that doesn't look set to change anytime soon.
I don't need to remind you that our president, Vladimir Putin, has already explained that this anniversary is not the time to start pointing fingers. It's not the moment to rub salt in the wound. This date is an opportunity for us to learn lessons from the past to arrive at reconciliation amongst ourselves. What is the difference between this anniversary and the way these sorts of things were celebrated in the time of the Soviet Union? Well, when everything was centralized, everything was about following orders. It followed a strict script. We have consciously decided to reject that approach.
The Vice Minister is the sole government figure involved in the committee charged with organising the centenary. Other members include historians, museum directors and media bosses, who are putting together a programme of discussions and exhibitions. Political parties are keeping their distance, and there'll be no national commemoration. The government is keeping a low profile.
On the one hand, it's impossible not to understand Vladimir Putin's regime as a continuation of the Soviet regime. Modern-day Russia is a global power, a superpower even. But on the other hand, any revolution is a catastrophe, an overhaul. It marks a break with continuity and tradition, and that's seen by the current leadership as negative, undesirable. And that's why they haven't come up with any one unified response to this. The regime doesn't know how to mark the centenary.
К тому, как отмечать столетие.
The myths of 1917, namely the triumph of social justice and the primacy of collective enterprise, no longer form the core of the Russian curriculum. The textbooks have been rewritten.
Hello everyone, let's begin. Stand up. Sit down. Today we're going to talk once again about the Russian Revolution, the Revolution of 1917. My name is Olga Ukolova. I was born in 1968 in Ekaterinburg. I work as a history teacher in a secondary school in the city. When you hear 1917 revolution, what does that mean for you?
The government changes in the country. One regime takes the place of another. The monarchy gives way to the republic.
Yes, good. Push that further.
The dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yes, the dictatorship of the proletariat. If we talk about a Bolshevik coup d'etat, about the dictatorship of the proletariat, that's because in our culture for a long time, we've studied the October Revolution as a separate event. February was seen as a prologue. The USSR really wasn't very interested in it. For them, it was all about October, the great socialist revolution of October. That's what your parents and your grandparents learned with regards to that period of history.
16 and 17-year-olds now learn that February and October were two elements of the same revolutionary process.
I think that the revolution was an important step for all humanity. We had to go through a period of communism to show that actually capitalism is the better system. It works better. It's a more reliable way of structuring the economy.
It's a good example of the way things shouldn't be done.
And why is that?
Because there were too many victims, too much human sacrifice. There was an extreme economic crisis, which made other world wars possible. It had consequences for the whole planet.
In the current context of globalization and the terrorist threat, if that revolution happened now, it would be even worse. There would be even more catastrophic consequences than those we experienced 100 years ago.
The kids insist they don't want that sort of tragedy to happen again. It's part of a wider trend. At the beginning of the 1990s, we saw a total rejection of the entire Soviet experience. The revolution was reinterpreted as a coup, with all the negative connotations that carries. It was no longer the great socialist October Revolution, but rather an illegitimate takeover. The Bolsheviks seized power without justification and without support. They became the baddies, whereas before it was the great Russian Empire. That Russia was lost, and everyone who worked to destroy it became evil by definition. So everything that belonged to the empire was good.
In
Putin's Russia, the imperial past is revered. And nowhere is that more visible than in Ekaterinburg's Church on Blood, built in 2000. It stands on the site of the former Ipatiev house, where Tsar Nicholas II and his family were executed by the Bolsheviks. The Tsar, his wife, and their 5 children were later canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church. The fallen monarchy recast as Christian martyrs.
I truly have a lot of compassion for them. You can't deny that they needlessly suffered terribly. But I don't know. I can understand the canonization of little Tsarevich Alexei and his siblings, but I don't agree with the Tsar being turned into a saint. In many ways, his actions weren't those of a saint.
Most historians see Nicholas II as a deeply flawed ruler, but the Church has turned him quite literally into an idol.
It's actually quite strange, because in February 1917, large parts of the clergy actually distanced themselves from the Tsar. They lent their support to the provisional government and did absolutely nothing to save the monarchy. So what's happening now is in many ways quite strange. I think it has to be seen as an attempt by the Church to appropriate history.
These days, the Church also plays an important role in reconnecting descendants of members of the White Movement with their Russian roots. Every year at Easter, Georges returns to his childhood home in France, just outside of Paris. His old garden is home to one of the oldest Orthodox chapels in the country.
I was born here. In fact, my father has been looking after the chapel here for the last 53 years. The chapel was built by people who belonged to the first wave of Russian immigration to France. In fact, the first service was held here. It was Easter 1924. It's a real tradition. Paris's Russian community knows that every Easter Sunday, the Osorgan family holds Mass here. Everyone who comes is in some way linked to that wave of white immigration.
During Soviet rule, France's Orthodox churches cut all ties with the church in Moscow on the orders of the regime. Once the USSR had collapsed, Orthodox churches abroad were reabsorbed into Moscow's religious jurisdiction. In fact, this bishop is based at the new Kremlin-funded Russian cathedral in central Paris. Nonetheless, many here don't understand Georges' decision to leave France for Russia. They didn't experience the revolution firsthand, but they all grew up in the long shadow it cast.
Obviously, I can't forgive them. It's impossible to forgive them. You know, they destroyed a culture, a civilization, a way of life. So much that needs to be reestablished.
For us, this is really a year of mourning. It's a sad year. 100 years ago, a totalitarian regime established itself in Russia, and I think true reconciliation will only come about when the symbols of the Bolshevik regime, of that totalitarian regime, are destroyed. First of all, Lenin's mausoleum has to be moved or destroyed. His body needs to be buried normally, somewhere else, somewhere other than the mausoleum on the Red Square.
Back in Russia, we're in St. Petersburg, the city where it all began. It's the 1st of May, International Workers' Day.
Молодец! А что молодец? Что пришел? Молодец, что пришел, да? Да. Иванова!
My name is Irina Ivanova. I'm a communist member of St. Petersburg Local Assembly. I was born in Leningrad.
В каком году мы с вами не родились? Родились мы в 17-м году. В каком году мы с вами не родились? Родились мы в 17-м году.
What was Lenin's mission? It was to create a form of social organization that was completely different from what came before it, a fair and socially minded state, and he succeeded. Today, our objective is still the dictatorship of the proletariat.
A former company boss, Irina swapped business for politics in the mid-2000s. She campaigns for the rights of veterans and pensioners and tries to enthuse young people about the communist cause.
The current government inherited a nuclear superpower when the USSR collapsed, but in the past 20 years, under an alcoholic and mafia-style governance, the country has become dependent on its natural resources. We, members of the communist youth, refuse to accept it any longer.
Something else they refuse to accept: the Kremlin's fondness for downplaying the significance of 1917. In 2004, Putin decreed that the anniversary of the revolution would no longer be a national holiday.
For me, the most noticeable thing about this centenary is the absolute silence that's greeting it. The celebrations are muted, and that's because we have a lot of political and economic problems in this country. If we spent time really getting to grips with the revolution, the authorities know the people might be inspired to turn against them. But they can't completely destroy this celebration. It's impossible to delete it from our memory. That memory will exist for many years to come.
The communists are the only ones to have organized large-scale celebrations in major cities across Russia.
The Great Socialist Revolution of October came about not because radicals took power, but because the vast majority of people supported it. And that same majority has celebrated this date all their lives.
Я строю замок на песке, я знаю все на грани срыва, а мы шагаем.
Renee takes us to some land that, before the revolution, was home to a number of textile factories owned by her family.
Рука в руке.
There's also a small museum dedicated to those Russian capitalists who lost everything in 1917.
У нас не так. Непрочен и зыбуч фундамент, и насмехаются над нами.
Everyone in my family thought that the revolution was a good thing. It actually offered them a sort of opportunity as individuals. Without 1917, they'd all have ended up in textiles. But instead they became scientists, artists, film directors. I've never heard anyone in my family say, "Oh, it was a tragedy, they took everything." My dad even thanked God.
Transformed from bourgeois industrialists to Soviet intellectuals, Renee's family experienced firsthand the effects of a regime change they had wanted, but later came to regret. The revolution may have heralded an age of economic and social modernization, but it also gave way to forced collectivism, totalitarianism, and terror.
I think that the current government, and even the church, could publicly admit their guilt in certain areas. But I'm not demanding anything. I didn't come back here to demand anything. I came here to pursue a culture and identity that had been transmitted down to me by my family. Today I consider myself lucky to have these two cultures.
By choosing to settle in Russia, Georges and those like him have chosen the lure of tradition over the politics of resentment, resurrecting a way of life that the Bolshevik regime sought to destroy. Without any comprehensive attempt to truly come to terms with the events and aftermath of 1917, many now prefer to see the revolution as nothing more than an accident of history.
That's it for this Reporters Plus. Thank you very much for watching. You can, of course, see it again via our website, france24.com. Till the next time, please stay with us.